Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast we started 17 years ago. Some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/wordinyour-ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So, Mark, there's a protest album about AI on Spotify. It's called Is This What We Want? Can you explain it to me, Mark?
That's right. It's by 1,000 artists, which include various people, Kate Bush and Damon Albarn, Tori Amos, Annie Lennox, Imogen Heap, Cat Stevens, etc., etc. And the idea is that they are protesting about the UK government's suggestion they're going to change the copyright law about artificial intelligence. In late 2024, our government suggested that they changed this law to allow AI companies to build their products using other people's copyrighted work. That would include photography, art, literature, videography, dance, theatre, poetry, music, etc., to be done without a license. And they, quite understandably, these 1,000 artists have produced this record, which consists of 12 tracks. And the titles of these tracks are single words that, when spelt in the right order, spell out the sentence, the 12 words, "The British government must not legalise music theft to benefit AI companies." And various people have contributed a track to this record, which is meant to be Silence. But I've listened to it, and I wonder how many people have listened to it. I haven't listened to all of it. I've dipped into it because I was interested in trying to work out which the Kate Bush track was, which is the big interest. And they're not silent at all. It's actually a really extraordinary record, because each track is basically, its theme is that there is human presence, usually in a kind of slightly echoey room. So you hear footsteps and you hear breathing and you hear people opening curtains and you hear people tinkering with machinery. And on one of the tracks, somebody sweeps the floor. And there's just this general sense of, you can hear central heating, you hear the sense of the presence of human beings. I think most people worked out the Kate Bush track, which is the last one, which is Companies. And if you listen to that, it basically is unlike all the others. It's got cats purring. It's got the sound of bird song outside, and it's obviously either done in a country studio, unlike the other ones, or it's just done with a window open. But I mean, she's very famously fond of cats and bird songs, so that's probably it. So that's basically what it amounts to. I mean, there's another bizarre controversy about the people who aren't on it, and people are going, "Well, the Rolling Stones aren't on it, and Phil Collins is not." This is just absolute nonsense. I mean, obviously they could only have 1,000 people involved. If your name isn't on it, does that automatically imply that you're against the idea of it and therefore perfectly happy for AI companies to use your music without license? I mean, it's absurd. But that's the broad drift of it. A silent album. I wonder if anyone's actually listened to it all the way through.
Well, I had to listen to it earlier, and my question to you is the message supposed to be that if this all goes ahead, there will be no more music? That it won't be worth anybody recording music or originating music. Is that the argument, or is it not?
I guess it probably is. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I suppose that the idea, I was just getting the idea that it was meant to be silent, but in each of them you could just feel a human presence. So there was no such real thing as silence. But no, I think that's probably a fair point, actually.
Because if that's the case, that strikes me as not a very convincing argument. Because I was picking up a record today. I picked up an LP record. Actually, I'll tell you what happened the other day. I picked up an LP record that I'd realised I'd had for more than 40 years. And I hadn't actually listened to it before. And
What was it?
It was a Paco de Lucia soundtrack for the Terence Stamp film The Hit. Don't ask me why. Anyway,
Wow.
It was there. And I got it out. Because I've got quite a few records I never played before. And
I've got some in the cellophane, which is an indication.
Yeah, there you go. And anyway, I got it out and, it's got an inner bag. And what does it say on the inner bag, Mark? What does it say on the inner bag?
Is it going to be something about pirating or bootlegging or copying?
No, it's going to say home taping is killing music.
Yeah,
home taping is killing music. Okay. That was what was killing music for 20 years, was it? Or something that was that was the standard argument. And then there was, I can't remember in what order there was an order about there was going to be a tape levy or there was going to be this or that. And then there was Napster.
Well, there was internet stealing music, wasn't there?
Whatever.
Peer to peer.
And at every stage, one argument allegedly clinching was deployed. And that argument was, if this, whatever this is, and it's AI or prior to that, it was, kind of ease of ripping and burning from CDs or all those things we all did and have forgotten. The argument underneath them was always, if this goes on, there will be no more recorded music. People will no longer consider it worthwhile to do these things. Okay? Now, has there ever, at any stage in the last 50 years, been any indication that that's the truth? Because I don't think there has. Because there is
not,
more.
but I don't think it's a slightly different argument. Because see,
ripping
CDs was, the pro argument for that was that a load of people who wouldn't have heard your record got to hear it because somebody had got them a free copy, and they wouldn't have heard your record if they had to go out and pay $13.99 for it or whatever. And on the basis of some of those people hearing that music, they liked you enough to go out and buy all your records and come and buy your concert tickets and actually see you in person. So it was a way of getting yourself known. The issue here is that if you write a song and AI absorbs the essence of that song and its lyric or its chord sequence or whatever, it can then deploy that in different forms based entirely on what you did. And it may even be undetectable, but you're not going to get any money from it.
Okay, but, Mark, there is nothing that applies to music over this that doesn't equally apply to you and me. Absolutely anybody who's producing content of any kind.
Yeah.
Whether it's, us burbling away. Okay, imagine this, Mark. Imagine this. Okay. How long have we been doing this podcast for?
Since 17 years.
Okay, 17 years. Here we are. And it's largely consistent.
Passed by 35.
No, listen, and it's all there, okay? And so when you and I are dead and gone, it will be there will be, AI applications or whatever, perfectly capable of, putting together some kind of, they'll be able to have Mark Allen and David Hepworth talking about pop music that we haven't even heard, because it hasn't even been made yet. They'll be able to do that.
I like that idea.
Or they can just go back and listen to any one of the millions that we.
Yeah, you soak it all up. You could then get two old codgers. One occasionally gets quite excited about the Incredible String Band and the Soft Machine, and the other one's saying, "Oh my God, you've got to listen to this old bit of Duke Ellington or whatever." And it works, doesn't it?
The only way you'll be able to tell it's ours is that every 10 years there'll be me saying, "I don't think the Soft Machine were that big, actually, Mark." To be honest.
And me going, they're massive.
Yes. But anyway, do you care, Mark? Do you care, really? Are you bothered?
Do I get?
involved?
Well, I'm not somebody who's written a load of songs that has that are going to make me any money. And so if I thought that some application was stealing my intellectual property, then I would be aggrieved, because in this case it's not even recognizable. This is the song I wrote.
Okay, but I can go to AI, even in its, kind of crappy version now. I can go to it and say, could you write me a chapter of a book allegedly by David Hepworth about so-and-so? And it'll do it. Yeah?
Yep.
Am I really that bothered? Honestly? Because realistically, is anybody going to, buy a product on the basis of that? Is it going to, and also, here's one of the big issues with all this stuff. If you're worth stealing from, you're worth something. You know what I mean? And, that's, if people bother to pinch what you do has a value. And you're probably realizing quite a lot of that value. Now, I think listen, it's a complicated issue, and I wouldn't claim to know the answer. But, behind a lot of this is big companies maybe being rather worried about, that currently, if you want to, I don't know, you've got photo agencies or whatever. So if you want to have a picture of, I don't know, a Wimbledon tennis match or something, you have to go and buy one from an agency now. With AI, you could probably get them to just generate one. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you could see,
or change an existing one to the point where it couldn't be traced. Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, I just don't know about all this. But if the argument is, and I'm quite agnostic about it, and what I understand about the government's proposal is that you're, unless you opt out, you're opted in. Yes, and that's an issue. I understand. And but what I think about this is all this applies to journalists, writers, all these kind of people, just as much as musicians. And nobody ever bothers about journalists at all. You know what I mean? You can, when there's anything threatening the livelihood of musicians, the largest violin in the world is pulled out, and we're well, you and I have known thousands of journalists who no longer work, over the last 20 years, haven't we? Nobody's bothered about them at all, have they? I'm not saying,
still can't see the parallel. I can't see how AI is going to produce a convincing pastiche of somebody's book that people will buy in lieu of their own work.
Right,
I can't see how they're going to lose money from it.
Okay,
but I do understand that
if I do a convincing pastiche of Coldplay now, what's the value of that? Seriously, because listen, there are 1,000,001 groups who could do you a convincing pastiche of Coldplay. No difficulty at all. Is it any good to them? Really? If you look at the way the music business works, is it really? Are people looking for things that sound like Coldplay? No, they want Coldplay. And there are Coldplay providing lots of Coldplay, doing very well out of it for a very long period of time. Far longer than anybody's ever done in the past. Is there any evidence that people have said
that if you can't steal from somebody and then market it as them, which you can't, then are you genuinely doing them any harm? I don't know. Because any songwriter could sit there and listen to a load of songs and work out all the chord sequences and lyric ideas and just put them together as a song.
Now you got machines who can do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Does it really help? Does it really? I don't know. I think maybe at an industrial level, it's probably a threat. I'm not sure at an individual level, it's all that much of a threat myself. I don't know. I may be proved completely wrong. But, I've never seen any cases of people saying, I used to read Agatha Christie's books, and then I found a machine that can do Agatha Christie books slightly cheaper. And so I read those instead. It doesn't work like that.
Doesn't work like that.
Does it? It's not a kind of low cost provider. environment, is it? It's entertainment. And you fix on certain things irrationally, and you develop relationships with them and attachments to them that in some cases last for insane amounts of time, And
I still have some sympathy for a load of people who think deep down that they're somehow being fleeced.
Well,
I can see that would be destabilizing.
Okay, but what do all musicians think? What do absolutely every last one of them you've ever met, what do they all think? They all think, deep down, I'm being fleeced. Absolutely, without exception.
They all feel that they should somehow have more critical respect and have more commercial success. This is something we were discussing with Moon Zappa on a podcast this morning. And I really sympathize with that, because why wouldn't you? No matter how successful you are, no matter how much people appear to like you, you always wish it'd been a little bit more in both respects. It's totally understandable.
Well, I mean, do you look back on your long career and think, well, really, I was, people overlooked me and
not remotely, but I'm not a songwriter. I mean, what am I going to say? Gosh, I was the editor of Q magazine for 5 years. I wish people had liked it more. They appeared to really like it. Enough people liked it to satisfy me, and I'm not sitting there weeping about it.
Yeah. But here's the other big difference between you and the musician. They're all still doing it. That's the other thing. There's the other thing that didn't factor in when they started at the age of 18. Tell you what, you'll still be doing this when you're 75. And you'll be more famous than ever when you're 75. So if people, I go back to my point, if people are bothering to steal from you, that's a good thing, because the worst position to be in is when nobody wants to steal from you.
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
We were talking last week in response to Thomas Walsh had been in touch, hadn't he? And he'd been reading your old review of, was it Tug of War by Paul McCartney? I think it was Tug of War by Paul McCartney. Which I have to say, I personally have no memory of your review at all, but clearly it had rattled Thomas's cage 30, 40 years later or whatever it was.
I presume the review was substandard, see me, could do better.
Could do better.
So-called Paul McCartney.
And anyway, that then led to a friend of the pod, Alan Wallace. Getting in touch and saying that, talking about reviews that people might have regretted. And he sent us a review. He didn't say what it was, but it was it was Lester Bangs loosing off on some double album that had a huge reputation. This was him at the time, and could we guess what it was? We were speculating.
Should we read out a little bit of this review?
Yeah, go on. Have you got it there?
I've got it here actually. He says this is him in 1972. He says you get some unsettling glimpses from the lyrics, a real sense of self-doubt, fear, and vague regret. I've heard that they, this is the group, are feeling extremely insecure about their importance now as voices and style setters, and they damn well should be. And they're preparing for this tour with all the nervousness of kings whose domain seems likely to topple, not from revolution, but cancer. If that's the case, this record is a desperate attempt to reassert their dominance, and everything about it, down to their decision to make it their first two-record statement, is symptomatic of that desperation. And even then, it remains, from composition to production, a setup, a smokescreen. It takes you so long to hear the damn thing, and much of what's underneath the haze is so insubstantial. He's on his high horse now.
He is.
You're liable to give up in disgust unless you're totally obsessed with the band, in which case you plough on through doggedly, through endless replayings, and end up feeling pretty unhappy about the whole thing. So there it is.
So it's Lester Bangs, and, he was coming in off his long run, as we say, loaded for bear, as I think they say in the United States, on the subject of the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. Now, let's just say one thing. If he entertained any hope that this was the Rolling Stones about to be toppled from their position of preeminence and found out. He couldn't have been more wrong, could he?
He could have been wronger.
Because that was the beginning.
It eventually became to be the classic Stones album, didn't it?
No, but also, regardless, we'll come to that in a second, but regardless of that, this was the Rolling Stones at the beginning, launching their imperial phase, wasn't it? You know, when they went from playing for students to playing massive, great football stadiums and so forth. You know, that is the second stage of the Rolling Stones when they moved to France and the Rolling Stones records and Mick Taylor and all that kind of stuff. So he was completely wrong on that score. But I do think it was worth, reading that again, because I'm old enough to remember when Exile on Main St came out. And, what he wrote was not untypical of the kind of prevailing view of the time. I can remember when this record came out. And it's partly because it's a double album, because it always takes people a long time with a double album. But, I think if you could have summarized the general reaction to Exile on Main St in 1972, and you might want to hold on to a solid surface because this may be stressful for younger listeners who've grown up with the myth of Exile on Main St and have watched all the Friday night BBC 4 documentaries and read all the loving retrospectives about it in Mojo and, read all the things in the Sunday supplements and just regard it as the absolute acme of the Rolling Stones. Let me tell you, the general reaction to the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main St in 1972 can be summarized in the following word: meh.
It's the first use of the word meh. Meh. It's a little bit meh. That's a lot meh. No, it wasn't. It didn't set the world on fire, and also didn't have any
hit.
I mean, Tumbling Dice, yes, eventually, but it didn't really have any hits.
No, but Tumbling Dice did not get. Let's get this straight. Let's get this straight. Mark. Let's just do the context here. What you have to remember is the Rolling Stones, the 60s, chart-topping dance band. Satisfaction. All these things. Have you seen Your Mother? Jumping Jack Flash. Honky Tonk Women. All these things. Brown Sugar. All these records had been number one records. Tumbling Dice was not a number one record.
No, it wasn't.
And I think that was regarded as a bit of a failing, particularly since they had a new record company for the first time in years. New record company would come in there and say, "Step aside, Decker Squares. We're the hipsters from Atlantic. We know what we're doing." And they couldn't get a number one. So everybody thought, "Oh, well, that's a bit poor." And there are very few kind of standout tracks on Exile on Main St. Now, if you go to the previous...
not written by them, wasn't there? Shake Your Hips by Slim Harper.
Oh, then,
Stop Breaking Down, Robert Johnson. So it wasn't all Stones, actually.
Well, because if you read the reminiscences of people who were there when they were making it and, recording the tracks at Nelcott in 71 or whatever, more than one of them said, "Well, it's all very well, but there's no songs here. They haven't written a song. It's Keith kind of, turning out yards and yards of Keith. Yeah. It's yards and yards of Stones type sound.
See, my
which
view
never
is
really comes to anything.
I don't think it became popular until the age of the music press.
Oh, yeah.
Going back and rebooting these whole eras and re-presenting them as something that was somehow legendary and fabulously romantic. Because once you started to hear, and I can remember this with me too, reading about Nelcott, Chateau Nelcott, and this sort of debauchery and the Stones mobile and the life they led down there. It all sounded fantastically glamorous and exciting. So ultimately, what you've got is your own kind of mental image, your own internal movie of the essence of the Stones and their kind of decadence. And this record, this double album, is the sort of soundtrack to that, I think. And also the other thing is it's packaging. I think it's a lot to do with the cover, because that cover shot was I think from the wall of a Route 66 tattoo parlor.
It's very interesting. The cover has so many pictures. And, and if you like album covers with loads and loads of pictures, which I did. Everybody does.
Oh, yeah.
And that's just
pour over them for hours.
Because it's Robert Frank, the American kind of...
Robert Frank, that's the guy.
Strange auntie photographer. But then also Dominique Tallet, the French photographer who was there with them at Nelcott. So you have the combination of these kind of strange images of kind of rural America. And then you have those pictures of them gathered around a microphone with a bottle of Jack Daniels in, down in the sweaty basement of the south of France, in a house that was reputedly the Gestapo headquarters during the German occupation. So it was just full of dark, glittering glamour, wasn't it? It's perfect as a piece of image mongering. It is without peer. There's no doubt about that.
And those characters on the cover, a lot of them are kind of circus freaks, aren't they? There's the guy with the three balls in his mouth, and all those kinds. And that they're all kind of outsiders and just weird people who don't fit in. And that also is part of the whole Stones folklore, I think.
It's brilliantly packaged. But, and there are times when, you play it and you kind of really like it and so forth. But if you put it next to the previous album, which is Sticky Fingers, and you look at the standout tracks on Sticky Fingers, Brown Sugar and Bitch and Moonlight Mile and Can You Hear Me Knocking and Dead Flowers and these things. They were all. It was full of showstoppers. Whereas Exile On Main St is not really.
It's another example of a record that you like the idea of it, possibly more than the sound of it. I do. Because I don't play very often, but I do like the idea of it because it's
the idea of it is
usually Stones. It's absolutely epic. It's the stonesiest Stones thing. It's
more Stones than you can ever possibly imagine. Yeah. No doubt about it. It makes me think of the TV program that was probably on round about the time it was made. There used to be a comedy about an Irish and a tailoring company, with one Irish partner, one Jewish, and it was called Never Mind the Quality, Feel the Width. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And that's what I think about when I think about Exile on Main St. So going back to Lester Bangs.
Lester Bangs, let's be honest, Lester Bangs was right. And also, it doesn't matter. We talked about this last week. Rock critics get it wrong. Of course they do. They're under a lot of pressure. They don't have a lot of time. They've only heard the record once. They've got to get the copy in by 6 o'clock in the evening, And they're immortalized, chiseled out in stone for the rest of their lives. Is this thing that they wrote that they probably don't dare to even contemplate. But there we are. Not that it bothered Lester Bangs. So there we are.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
Really sad, rather unsettling news this week about Gene Hackman and his wife, and a story that's still developing. And I'm not sure if I really want to read any more about it. Actually, it's pretty grim. But it did strike both of us, didn't it? That Gene Hackman is very unusual because it sustained an enormous career for a long, long time, with the possible exception of being Popeye Doyle in the French Connection, without really ever being the lead actor.
Oh, I don't know. He was lead in loads of things, but he's just never a hero. It's weird. And
I mean, not the conventional lead actor, as well.
Yeah, the leading man tends to be a hero figure. Gene Hackman really quite like that.
Yeah.
And tell you one thing that struck me. I was watching an old interview of him being interviewed by David Letterman. And it struck me the hairline of Gene Hackman alone ought to have disqualified him from ever being a movie star. He had a hairline that kind of looked neither one thing nor the other. You know what I mean? And it looked as if it ought to have been sorted out at some stage in a Hollywood laboratory, but it never was. And that never really mattered, did it? Because his background, what was he, 95 when he died?
95.
95. So he came from somewhere, Illinois, I think, somewhere like that, and very kind of modest background. And his father, in an incident that seems like something out of, I don't know, a Richard Ford book or something, his father just got in the car one day when he was 12 and just drove off. And the young Gene, can you remember him going past him as he was playing and waving to him? And he just left.
Drove off what? They never saw him again?
Never saw him again.
Did he just vanish? Did they lose track of him as well?
Well, that was the end of family life. So he was left to be raised by his mother, and there wasn't a lot of money around. And when he was 16, he went in the Marines. Now think about this: the Marines. It's not just the army or whatever; it's the Marines.
Yeah,
and they all say, I think they always say this about the U.S. Marines. I think they still do this: that if you join the U.S. Marines, and if you have ever joined the U.S. Marines, please get in touch and let me know whether I'm right. They always treat you as though you know nothing. That's the deal with Marines. We start from the very beginning and we build you up.
Yeah.
Which was a very attractive idea, a very particularly attractive idea for a 16-year-old who probably feels that they've got the shitty end of the stick as far as kind of upbringing and education and all those kind of things is concerned. So he does 5 years in the Marines, and then he leaves and becomes an actor. Now, is this still going on anywhere in the world?
That is boot camp. That's proper boot camp, isn't it?
And apparently, he was well known through the rest of his career. He was quite a stern figure on set.
I'm sure.
And if he felt the director or whatever wasn't doing what ought to be done. And of course, directing a film is like a military operation. It's not just an artistic endeavor, it's a military operation. You've got to coordinate massive numbers of people to do very difficult things in difficult circumstances. And he was well known for kind of stepping up to the plate and going, now bloody hell, get yourself sorted out. And if
get out of your dressing room, get on set and start acting.
And
put that cappuccino down.
And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And throughout his career, and I was looking at a load of his films, after this sad news, and obviously French Connection and Mississippi Burning and, I don't know. They all seem to have
Bonnie and Clyde. It's fantastic.
They all seem to have a scene where Gene Hackman confronts somebody. And things are going to get very, very bad for the somebody he is confronting. And do you know how you know, Mark? You know because Gene Hackman does the most disturbing thing he could ever do. He smiles. He smiles at people. Go and look. No, seriously.
That's good.
Go and look. There's a classic bit, Mississippi Burning, which is a really, really good film. He's investigating this kind of Ku Klux Klan, murder of civil rights workers in Mississippi. And he goes into some juke joint, where the dodgy police deputies hang about drinking beer. And he just sits opposite somebody and he gets very close to them. And he just smiles and smiles as he's talking about what's going to happen. And then he does something I don't think I've ever seen anybody do in a film before. He just, you don't actually see this, but you see the results. You see the character's reaction to what he's doing. He grabs him by the balls and twists really, really hard.
Yeah.
This guy just almost dies, And as he's doing this, the smile
you yourself
never
sitting
disappears.
in your seat squirm in sympathetic agony.
he always smiled, and you thought when Gene Hackman smiles, bad things are going to happen to somebody.
Yes. Oh, don't smile. Oh, please don't smile.
Please
I hate it when you smile.
And
That's really good.
And the of course, French Connection. I think it's pretty. No, I would have seen it. I saw him.
The opening scene of that is pretty extraordinary.
By Bonnie and Clyde, where he plays Clyde Barrow's elder brother, doesn't he?
Buck
Barrow.
He's fantastic in that.
Yes.
With his bonkers wife. God,
do you know how he got that part? Shall I tell you? Interesting pop fact.
Go on.
And and another kind of glimpse of just what it
is, because he's not very convincing physically as Warren Beatty's brother, is he?
That's true. That's
they're not like two peas in a pod.
Nobody could ever be convincing as Warren Beatty's brother. So. I mean, Shirley MacLaine's not convincing as Warren Beatty's sister, is she? It's kind of just doesn't work. But anyway, he got that part because he'd initially been cast in The Graduate as Mr. Robinson. So Anne Bancroft's husband. And he started work on the movie and got fired after a few days, presumably by Mike Nichols, the director. And so then he was available to do, he got that part because he was a mate of Dustin Hoffman. He and Dustin Hoffman shared an apartment, I think, when they were starving actors.
Oh, right.
And anyway, he then was available to do Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde. He did that, and of course, then it's Popeye Doyle in French Connection, which, as you say, has that epic. And I watched that again not long ago.
Sequence.
Well, he starts off dressed as Santa Claus, doesn't he? First of all,
yeah,
and the interesting thing about French Connection is that all the fast food they consume while staking out the bad guys all looks absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
I always remember that. Anyway, they go into this bar, don't they, and turn over the bar that's full of black guys, all spilling kind of drugs out their pockets when they're to try and avoid being caught in possession,
Yeah.
And he goes through that bar like a dose of salts, and it's absolutely repellent. Incredibly aggressive and openly racist, clearly openly racist. But I can remember seeing this when it was 1971, wasn't it? And thinking, my God, I don't think I've ever seen a scene like that before. And I watched it again.
But he also said, didn't he, that they'd started to film that in sequence. They started to film that opening scene, and he went to the director after a couple of days and said, I can't do this. I can't do this role. I don't feel I'm convincing enough to do it.
Well, he was.
Which after his Marines training, which I didn't know about, you'd think was nonsense. And he couldn't be a more qualified bloke, but it's a fantastic film.
Oh, yeah.
What a great actor.
No,
you're right. No, I mean, he lots of lead roles, but not a kind of leading man. It's not another Gene Hackman movie, is it? Where he's basically playing the same part. He really was very, very, very different.
Well, he was also, he'd spent a lot of money, I think, and he lost a lot of money, and he had tax bills to pay. There was a long period of time when he did an awful lot of films. He was always available. You know what I mean? So he's in absolutely extraordinary numbers of films. But
in the same way that Robert De Niro is now. He's in 7 films a week because he's got so many bills to pay. A lot of divorces and business ventures that have gone, turned up their toes.
I don't know if he's ever, he was gambling was as part of Gene Hackman's thing. The story about the other person who gambled a lot, the other famous actor who gambled a lot, and so that he just had to keep taking part, was Walter Matthau. I can't think about Walter Matthau without smiling. He just makes me laugh. The very idea of Walter Matthau.
Just the thought of his face just makes you fall about, doesn't it?
The spaniel features.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who it was. I saw a young actor reminiscing about doing a movie with Walter Matthau, and he was thrilled to work in Walter Matthau. And so he picked his moment in the first week and went up to him and said, I just want to say, Mr. Matthau, it's an enormous honor to be working with you. And what do you think of the script? And Walter Matthau looked at him and says, listen, kid, I'm into my book. My bookie's into me for $5 million. It's any old piece of shit. Let's get on with it.
Let's do it. I haven't even read it. That's a pro. That's a pro.
Well, you know what? You know what was on the back of the order of service. This is fact. What was on the back of the order of service, or the order of service for Walter Matthau's funeral? Do you know?
It's going to be a betting slip or something. Look.
It was tips for that afternoon's races.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. Oh God, I hope people had invested.
You would, wouldn't you?
You would. You would, just out of respect. Just in case you won. That's brilliant.
The Word Podcast, walking the digital dog since 2007.
Things we never say on the Word Podcast. Welcome to the Word Podcast. This week we've got, thanks for listening to the Word Podcast. Hope you'll join us next week. All that kind of stuff. Why do we never say this, Mark?
Because we're wild, maverick, untamable, unrubber-stampable rebels, Dave. And we're not Dave Lee Travis on Radio 2 in 1986. So there we are. That's how we roll.
I tell you what, very occasionally, I'm staying in a hotel. And it's only when staying in a hotel that I do something that I would never do at all, which is put the television on the first thing in the morning. And when I do, I'm always amazed that people are still sitting on sofas on breakfast television going, hello, welcome to, you know what I mean? And over to you, Jenny, and back to you, Fred, with the weather and all this. I think, hasn't this language just died a death by now? You know what I mean?
Apparently
not.
Are
are the people still going through these kind of empty demonstrations
patting
of
cushions on the sofa next to you? Come and sit here and tell me, say you've got a new tour. That's right.
Yes, absolutely.
Good luck.
Ridiculous.
It's always you say with good luck with the book. Good luck with the show.
Good luck with the
Yeah, and when it's
tour.
over, come back and tell us all about it.
Tell us all about it.
Yeah. You're welcome anytime.
Oh, dear.
Next, I know.
Oh, yeah.
So look, I tell you what, we're going to plug some things. We have talked to various people. We talked to Moon Zappa this morning.
we did.
That's not out for a week or two, but
God, she
that
was
is a fantastic
She
exchange.
was fantastic.
My goodness, she was good. She was grubby. She's talking about her book, Earth to Moon, which is about growing up in what I can honestly say with a hand on heart is the most dysfunctional domestic setup I think I've ever heard of in my life. And I'm sure you will agree when you've heard it. As she says at one point, is genius worth the collateral damage?
Yeah,
and that's
very fair point. Very fair point.
Really good point.
Because also, it struck me, when thinking about it afterwards, is that, how do you know it's genius? And what's that got to do with it anyway? Because there must be millions of people who are clearly not geniuses demanding the same amount of kind of deference. It must be happening.
It's true, and it made me think actually that calling anybody a genius is an immensely damaging thing. Do you remember when
hugely?
Oh my God! When Brian Wilson, the Beatles, when Derek Taylor, who'd done the press for the Beatles, took over the Beach Boys press, and the first thing he decided to do was to promote Brian Wilson as a genius. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And that actually was a complete catastrophe on a personal level.
It's the worst thing that could ever happen.
Worst thing that
could ever happen. Doesn't nobody?
And also, once somebody's been called a genius, then they kind of think, well, I'm a genius because somebody called me a genius. You know?
Yeah.
But anyway, she is phenomenal. We ought to mention also, we talked to Graham Fellows, who was really good. He of Jilted John and John Shuttleworth, and one cup of tea is never enough, but two is one too many. Up and down like a bride's nightie and pigeons in flight. So that was good. And we also would remind people that if you are a subscriber and go to the one of the upper tiers of the subscription possibilities, you can become a birthday patron, whereby on your birthday you get the chance to chuck a few logs on the conversational fire, and this week that fell to I've now completely forgotten. Sorry, Magic. Who was it? Nick Foreman. That's right. And this week, that falls to Nick Foreman.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
And yes, we're joined by Nick Foreman, who's going to pour a little bit of petrol on the conversational embers. Nick, how very nice to see you, and happy birthday. And what is what's your item on the agenda?
Well, I think when all is said and done, the Hunter Davies biography really is the biography for the Beatles.
And what are your grounds for saying this?
I think what happened historically is that the Lennon Remembers book somewhat coloured people's opinion that it was a whitewash. I think John was a little more cruel with that. But at the end of the day, it's a bunch of facts. They were born. This is how they formed. This is where they went. These are the various childhood incidents they had. We have the records. You can make your own opinion. You could form your own opinions on that. But this was very much a biography. Right. And I think everything that's followed, I mean, my two favourites in the meantime have been 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course the Mark Lewisohn book. But I think my go-to actually is always the Hunter Davies.
Really? Which came out, didn't it, while the Beatles were still going? I think it came out at the end of '68, didn't it? So it was right in the middle. The story wasn't over.
Well, it was actually the first proper book I ever purchased. It was 50p at Asda, and I bought it in '78, which was a kind of a reprint, reedition. Yeah. And it had some extra parts saying end bit, because within a year or so of the book being published, the Beatles split up. And in fact, at the time, and we know different now, Hunter Davies blamed it on Yoko. Actually, the subsequent editions have always been interesting for the new forwards in them, and I purchased those just because of the revised forwards.
Well, a forward written by Hunter.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Because it is a fascinating story in the sense that, you know, when he wrote it, nobody knew it was going to end. Nobody knew it was going to end, and certainly nobody knew that it was going to continue to echo in the way that it has done. That's the absolutely extraordinary thing, isn't it? You know, that our kind of views about the Beatles they've changed, you know, over how many years? 50 years.
And they've amplified. Every year they get bigger, don't they?
Yes, they do. You know, the level of devotion nowadays is far greater than it was back then. You know, people thought they were exceptional, but didn't realise how exceptional at all. You know, it's an interesting point you make. I'd have to go back and read it because I haven't read it for absolutely years. Is that it is one of the things that strikes me is that people didn't know anything like as much about how you made records and how you did things back in those days as they know now, you know. So there's so much knowledge to have nowadays, which wasn't there. You know, I doubt if Hunter Davies in 1967 would have gone and looked at session sheets or anything like that for, you know, how the Beatles had made Revolver or anything. You know,
I was looking back at my edition, and these days we have information over. Yeah. We can find out anything. Yeah. But at the back of the 78 edition, it has a discography, and it is the most vanilla discography in that it simply lists the albums and the songs. But it doesn't say, for example, who wrote the songs or when they were recorded or how they were published. Now, of course, I've got the Lewisohn recording sessions book, which annotates when the tea breaks were taken, and typically with Mark Lewisohn, what sort of sugar they purchased for the tea, etc. And actually, I think in the 1978 book, there's in the foreword, there's a certain resignation that. Well, they were really, really good, but obviously times are moving on, and perhaps in a couple of years, they'll just be a distant memory. I mean, I think in 1978, the Beatles' currency was, it's not what it is today. And I think were it not for the red and blue albums, and indeed not for Paul McCartney having the big hit Mull of Kintyre, they may have just drifted away. And then, of course, John's death, I think, rebooted and revitalised a lot of interest in it. I mean, I come to this obviously as a second generation fan who...
Well, Red and Blue is really interesting because the number of people we've talked to who are kind of 10 years younger than Dave and I, whose first Beatles records were Red and Blue because they weren't there during the developing story, as I'm sure you probably weren't either.
No,
and that was, if that's your first portal into the Beatles, you have a totally different approach to the whole idea of them. It's not chronological.
Absolutely. It's one of that amazing, and I think it's been said by previous of your correspondents. It's quite a revelation that the man who sang Mull of Kintyre was in the Beatles.
That's right.
We had a copy of Wings Greatest at home, and I said, "Well, that's the same fella, is it not?" And certainly, I think when John died, John was killed, and there was a John Lennon collection came out. I was struggling with that a little bit because I thought, I'm being told that John is better than Paul, but honestly, I really do think Wings Greatest is a better record than the John Lennon collection. It almost seemed like heresy at the time.
There'll be comments at the end of this. Can I recommend a couple of, very quickly, just a couple of other ones I think are really good. One you won't have read because it's not come out. It actually comes out in about a month's time, but it's Ian Leslie's book, and Dave and I talked to him the other day, called John and Paul. It's a love story in songs, and that is fantastic because it talks about the working relationship and the personal relationship between the two of them and how they wrote those songs together. And it's really detailed and really revealing and just concentrates on the best bits of the story. And the other one I think is the Richard DiLello's book about working at Apple, called, was it the
longest cocktail party?
Which is phenomenal. And he was only about 18 or 19, as an American student, I think, and he got a job working at Apple. And it's all about what it's like being in there, sitting around rolling joints and, drinking. And, the Beatles are wandering in and out. There's the Hells Angels are there. The Hare Krishnas are there. All the people who think they're going to get a record deal with Apple keep turning up with their demo tapes. It's thrilling, isn't it, Dave? Don't you think? As an insight to what the Beatles world was like at that time.
No, it is. It is. It is. I tell you, the thing that I do find fascinating in all this is the Rolling Stones are still around and still enormously popular. They're pretty much direct contemporaries of the Beatles. Nobody is interested in what happened on one day of the Rolling Stones' career in 1966 or 1964. Nobody at all. Nobody cares. Whereas everybody cares like crazy about the same things about the Beatles. There's just this strange, magnetism about them, isn't there? It doesn't apply to even somebody like Rolling Stones. It doesn't apply to Bob Dylan. It seems to me at all. Whereas we just the Beatles is like a Bible story. Tell me the old story. Tell me it again. Tell me it again. Tell me it again,
But another crucial part of that is that there's four of them. There's four characters, and you're interested in all four of those characters. So on that particular day with the Rolling Stones, you might be vaguely interested in what Keith or Mick would do. Do you honestly care what Bill Wyman's up to? Not so much, really. Whereas the Beatles, all four of them, their interaction is so crucial to it, I think.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well,
look, I may well go back and look at my copy of Hunter Davis's Beatles story. I wonder if he's still getting royalties for it. He probably will be.
I'm sure it's still selling.
It probably is still selling.
Yeah.
We had him as a guest on and Word in Your Ear event at the Islington some while ago. I don't think Mark was there. I think you're away or something.
Yeah.
And he had this brilliant, I don't know how old he was at the time, but he had this brilliant way of dealing with interviews, which I've now started to adopt myself, which is when he couldn't remember a detail, he would go, and of course that was on the album, and then he'd point at you, and you'd go, Revolver. That's right.
Well done. That's very good.
It's very charming thing. Yeah. And I give him points for that. Well, look, Nick, thanks for throwing that log on the fire.
Welcome.
And
thank you. And happy birthday again.
Happy birthday.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.